This is VOA News. Reporting by remote, I'm Joe Ramsey. Ukrainian forces reported battlefield gains on Wednesday in a counterattack that could signal a shift in the momentum of the war, while Kiev shut gas flows on a route through Russian-held territory, raising the threat of an energy crisis in Europe. Following days of advances north and east of the second-largest city, Kharkiv, Ukrainian forces were within just several kilometers of the Russian border on Wednesday morning, one Ukrainian military source said. The advance appears to be the fastest that Ukraine has mounted since it drove Russian troops away from Kiev and out of the country's north at the beginning of April. If sustained, it could let Ukrainian forces threaten supply lines for Russia's main attack force and even put rear logistic targets inside Russia itself within striking range of Ukrainian artillery. A Kremlin-installed official in the southern region of Ukraine seized by Russian troops says the area will ask Moscow to annex it. AP correspondent Charles de Ledesma reports.
The talk of annexation in Kherson and Russia's apparent willingness to consider such a request has raised the possibility that the Kremlin will seek to break off another piece of Ukraine. Russia annexed Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula in 2014. Now the deputy head of the Kherson Regional Administration installed by Moscow says the city is Russia, adding he wants Vladimir Putin to make it a proper region of Russia. I'm Charles de Ledesma.
Meanwhile, Wednesday's move by Ukraine to cut off Russian gas supplies through territory held by Russian-backed separatists marked the first time the conflict has directly disrupted shipments to Europe. This is VOA News. Even though the U.S. evacuated some 116,000 Afghans last August when the Taliban took over the country, some 78,000 Afghans holding special immigrant visas were left behind. Now, one of the fortunate ones to leave recently is an interpreter first profiled by VOA last year. VOA senior Washington correspondent Carolyn Perjuti brings us the story of how he finally got out.
Children to look outside. And who thought Najibullah can't believe what he sees in the Seattle air. His first snow. He calls home to tell his children to look outside. It's one of many firsts for a man who thought he'd be dead by now.
Taliban.
When VOA first spoke to Najib last July, he was targeted for death by the Taliban because he was an interpreter for U.S. Special Forces. Outside the Kabul airport, Najib's toddler was knocked unconscious in the chaos as they tried to escape. The family of 7 was left behind as the final American planes left Afghanistan, so they returned to their home in Jalalabad. Without the government's help, Najib's former officers stepped in with personal money, as did the nonprofit No One Left Behind. But as a wanted man, Najib had to find a way to get his family past 12 checkpoints to return to the capital. The family flew out of Afghanistan and waited in Pakistan for their special immigrant visas. Then last month, finally touching down on U.S. soil, they were greeted by Afghan Americans. Najib, an electrical engineer by trade, has found work at a friend's house. He plans to return to school for a certification. He's not the only one headed to school.
Her name is Sahar. She's 3.5 years old. Last name is Abu Bakr. He's 6 years old. My other son.
His 5 children have missed a few years of school because of COVID, then because of the Taliban's restrictions on girls. But here,
so they can do anything they want, anywhere they want to go. So they will be free forever.
And Najib is now free to go anywhere too. Carolyn Persuti, VOA News, Seattle, Washington.
Recapping our top story, Ukrainian forces reported battlefield gains on Wednesday in a counterattack that could signal a shift in the momentum of the war, while Kiev shut gas flows on a route through Russian-held territory, raising the threat of an energy crisis in Europe. Find more on these stories and the rest of the day's news on our website, voanews.com. Reporting by remote, I'm Joe Ramsey.
This is VOA News. Via remote, I'm Marissa Melton. In his daily remarks to the Ukrainian people, President Volodymyr Zelensky on Wednesday thanked the United States for a $40 billion aid package that is expected to pass the U.S. Congress. But on Thursday, it appears a political snag may have delayed that funding. VOA's Jeff Custer reports from Washington.
U.S. Senate Democratic Majority Leader Chuck Schumer went to the Senate floor Thursday to say there are still issues to be worked out among Republican senators, and it appeared there'd be no vote on the measure before next week. Some senators were apparently pushing for more oversight of the aid. Schumer appealed for the chamber to send a clear message about U.S. support for Ukraine.
As the war in Ukraine enters its third bloody month, we must leave no stone unturned in making Putin and his cronies pay a price and helping the Ukrainian people. Their fight against Russian aggression is a struggle between democracy and authoritarianism itself.
Republican Minority Leader Mitch McConnell spoke immediately after Schumer, saying he wants to see Republicans reach an agreement so they could still pass the aid package Thursday. Jeff Custer, VOA News, Washington.
Finland's leaders have come out in favor of joining NATO, and Sweden could do the same within days. That would amount to a historic European realignment 2.5 months after Russian President Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine raised fears among Russia's closest Western neighbors. In a joint statement Thursday, Finland's President Sauli Niinistö and Prime Minister Sanna Marin said NATO membership would strengthen Finland's security. They said Finland must apply for NATO membership without delay and expressed hope the domestic steps still needed to make the decision final would be taken rapidly, perhaps within the next few days. From Washington, this is VOA News. The House of Republicans panel in the United States, the U.S. House of Representatives panel investigating last year's Capitol building riot on January 6th, has issued subpoenas to 5 colleagues, including the House's Republican leader. AP Washington correspondent Sagar Meghani has that story.
A step with little precedent. Subpoenas for 5 sitting members of Congress, including House GOP Chief Kevin McCarthy. Investigators have been looking into his conversations with then-President Trump as the riot unfolded. Less than a week after the insurrection, McCarthy had said Trump bared some responsibility.
He should have immediately denounced the mob when he saw what was unfolding.
The panel wants to know about McCarthy's talks with Trump before, during, and after the riot, along with details on meetings the 4 other subpoenaed lawmakers had with the White House: Andy Biggs, Mo Brooks, Jim Jordan, and Scott Perry. The subpoenas come as the committee prepares for public hearings this summer. Sagar Meghani at the White House.
North Korean state media say at least one person confirmed to have COVID-19 has died, and hundreds of thousands have shown symptoms of what it calls a fever. The news hints at the potentially dire scale of the country's first confirmed outbreak of COVID-19 since the pandemic began. The official KCNA news agency said some 187,800 people are currently being treated in isolation after a fever of unidentified origin spread nationwide starting in April. KCNA said around 350,000 people have shown signs of the fever. 6 people who showed fever symptoms have died, and it was one of those who was confirmed to have a case of COVID-19. The virtual global summit has come, the one that President Biden made opening remarks for on Thursday, came as the U.S. marked its 1 millionth death from COVID-19. President Biden issued a statement noting the tragic milestone. He said each death was an irreplaceable loss. He also said the country must remain vigilant against the pandemic and continue to do everything it can to save as many lives as possible. Biden recommended more testing, vaccines, and treatment, and urged Congress to sustain those resources. The 1 million mark represents about 1 death for every 327 Americans. That's about the entire population of San Francisco or Seattle. And once again, our top story this hour in daily remarks to his people, Ukrainian President Zelensky has thanked the United States for its $40 billion aid package, but that
This is VOA News. Via remote, I'm Diane Roberts. Ukrainian forces destroyed parts of a Russian armored column as it tried to cross a river in the Donbas region. Video from Ukraine's military showed, as the Ukrainian defense minister predicted many weeks of grinding fighting ahead. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said talks with Russia on getting wounded defenders out of the Azovstal plant in Mariupol were very complex, adding Kyiv was using influential intermediaries. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin called for an immediate ceasefire when he spoke by telephone to his Russian counterpart, Sergei Shoigu, for the first time since Russia's February 24th invasion of Ukraine, according to the Pentagon. The U.S. has made its highest-level contact with Russia since the Ukraine war started in late February. AP Washington correspondent Sagar Magani has more.
Pentagon Chief Lloyd Austin spoke today with Russian counterpart Sergei Shoigu for the first time since a week before the invasion. Spokesman John Kirby gave few details, but says Austin urged an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine and emphasized the importance of maintaining communications. Pentagon officials have said for months Moscow's refused to take calls from either Austin or Joint Chiefs Chairman Mark Milley. Sagar Magani at the White House.
A Ukrainian court held a preliminary hearing Friday in the first war crimes trial arising from Russia's February 24th invasion after charging a captured Russian soldier with the murder of a 62-year-old civilian. The case is of huge symbolic importance for Ukraine. The Kyiv government has accused Russia of atrocities and brutality against civilians during the invasion and said it has identified more than 10,000 possible war crimes. This is VOA News. WNBA star Brittany Griner's pretrial detention in Russia has been extended by 1 month, the AP's Ed Donahue reports.
Griner appeared for a brief hearing at a court outside Moscow, handcuffed, wearing an orange hoodie and holding her face down. Her attorney, Alexander Boykov, told the AP he thinks the relatively short extension indicates Griner's case could go to trial soon. She's been in custody for nearly 3 months, detained at Moscow airport in February after vape cartridges containing oil derived from cannabis were allegedly found in her luggage. Boykov was asked how Griner is being treated. He says, "We did not receive any complaints about the detention conditions from our client." Ned Price at the State Department says diplomats from the U.S. Embassy in Moscow spoke with Griner and reported she is doing as well as can be expected in these circumstances. I'm Ed Donahue.
Israeli riot police Friday pushed and beat pallbearers at the funeral for slain Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, causing them to briefly drop the casket. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said at a news conference the funeral procession images are deeply disturbing.
We regret the intrusion into what should have been a peaceful procession. We've urged respect for the funeral procession, the mourners, and the family at this sensitive time. We're also in close touch with Israeli and Palestinian authorities, have been and obviously will continue to be, especially given the images we've seen today.
The interim findings of an Israeli army investigation could not determine who fired the bullet that killed Abu Akleh, the military said. New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern said in an Instagram post that she has tested positive for COVID-19. The White House advisor who tapped Saudi royals to fund a covert war in Nicaragua and flew on a secret mission to sell arms to Iran in the scandal that shook U.S. President Ronald Reagan's presidency has died. Robert McFarlane was 84. McFarlane was in Michigan visiting family and died Thursday of complications from a prior illness, his family said in a statement. He first worked in the White House under Richard Nixon as a military aide to Foreign Policy Chief Henry Kissinger after serving 2 tours in Vietnam as a Marine officer. At least 27 people died and dozens were injured. A massive fire in a building in the Indian capital New Delhi Friday, emergency services said. A fire chief said injuries include those who jumped from the building. Around 60 to 70 people have been rescued, local media quoted police as saying. The Times of India reports the owner of the building was in custody. And recapping our top story, Ukrainian forces destroyed parts of a Russian armored column as it